Hey, welcome back. It is the Wake Coaching Podcast. We're so glad that you joined us today. I'm Jeff.
I'm Allie.
We're so glad you're here.
Yeah.
And we're going to continue on with our topic of blended families. And so last time we kicked it off, it's huge.
Yeah.
It's huge. And we actually watched our last video. Really good, by the way. I'm just saying, if you haven't watched it, you for sure should.
The last one, I think, is really just setting a foundation for the conversation.
So good.
Yes, back up.
Back
Watch the previous
up.
episode if you haven't watched it yet.
It was so good. And so we're going to continue that. And I think there's a theme that came out of it, like that as we listen, it just, I don't know, like I mentioned it, we were talking about it, you mentioned it, just this idea of like blending can be brutal and it can be beautiful.
It's both.
It's both.
Yeah.
It's both. And I think you need to give it space for it to be both and expect it to be both. There's moments that are beautiful. There's moments that are brutal. And then hopefully in between, you really, truly are blending. And so let's jump into today's topic. What are we talking about today?
Well, so the first topic that let's say like a lesson, right? Lessons we've learned.
Principles.
From the past 4 years of blending.
Yep.
Number one is the marriage comes first.
Yeah.
And this is something that we really believe in. It's a little bit of just like a principle that we live by. But it's been interesting because as we've met other families who are blended, we've learned that is certainly not like a commonly held belief.
No.
And so I think this is important because I do think that if you're somebody who is in a blended family and the marriage isn't first, this might help you in really creating like a healthier marriage and family.
I can empathize and even understand why some people might not have like, okay, so you walk through a divorce. Generally, divorces, obviously, they aren't wonderful. There's a ton of pain. There's a ton of distrust. There's just a lot of trauma associated with it, and even drama associated with it. And then you get remarried, and all of a sudden you bring your kids into that, and your new spouse brings their kids into it, and you have this blending thing happening. And I can understand like, okay, I'm going to mama bear my kids, or I'm going to like daddy bear I'm going to be protective. Well, daddy bear's bad because daddy bears actually eat the cubs. That's not it. Okay. That's not,
well, we get the idea.
So you mama bear.
Sure.
Yeah. Right. So it's this protective piece, right?
It's a protective piece. I think it's also like depending upon how long you maybe have been single parenting before the blending process. The kids are used to it just being you and them. And it's kind of like us against the world at some points, like being a single parent household, like that's difficult on both the parent and the kids. And there is this element of like banding together and like, we're going to get through this together. And it's all about like, it's us, you know, and then you're inviting somebody else into that dynamic. And that can feel, I think, like a threat sometimes to the kids, like in the connection and the relationship that they've built with their parent in that time frame.
Well, I think even in that, like, roles can be blurred to a degree.
Oh, for sure.
Where all of a sudden, like, you know, where, you know, in my case, Tiffany was like, you know, an emotional support. Well, she's gone.
Yep.
So it'd be really easy for me. I still have like an emotional needs, and the kids have like an emotional vacuum because mom's gone. All of a sudden, like, we just like, they become my emotional support. I become their emotional support, which is maybe healthy to a degree, but like to a degree, but then, which is natural, but then there's a degree where it goes beyond what's healthy. And when you step in, all of a sudden they're threatened because you are replacing them.
Yeah.
And they're like,
and that's such a natural thing for kids to try to move in and help fulfill the needs that you should be getting filled by a spouse, like that emotional support you're talking about. Like, I mean, it's a very practical thing. You come home from your day and it's like, who do I process with? How do I get my needs met, like emotionally, like I'm feeling down and, you know, and so kids will naturally try to move into and fill that space because they love you and they can see it.
Yeah, they're super
and
empathetic.
Even like my 2.5-year-old, when I was single, like he would try to do that for me.
He tried to become the little man of the house.
Yes.
And he
the
like
little man
did.
in my life. Yeah. And luckily was actually learning about that very thing in that time frame, and so I was very aware of it. I think if I hadn't heard about it, I probably would have naturally just allowed him to do that,
Yeah.
And anyways, so point is there's nothing wrong with you if that is the dynamic you've created, like you're not bad. But that like allowing them to fill that space and move into that space is a lot of times putting too much weight on their shoulders. It's a burden they're really not meant to carry, like your emotional needs. And so that can be a piece of unhealth with it. And then, yeah, when you want to get remarried
Mm-hmm.
and now your husband should be taking that role, not one of your kids,
Mm-hmm.
they feel pushed out.
Yep. Yep.
And so I think those are all just kind of dynamics and elements that go on that create this like sentiment that we hear often, like, yeah, I'm remarried, but still it's all about my kids. Like
Mm-hmm.
they're the most important thing to me. And, my new husband comes second, or my new wife.
So I think about this. I think about even in the healthiest marriage where like it is a biological family, it's not blended,
Mm-hmm.
divorce hasn't happened, the drama and the trauma, all of that hasn't happened. You have kids, they're still going to push boundaries and triangulate parents. Right? They're still going to do that. They're still going to go to
Yeah.
mom and say, "Hey, mom, can I do this? Well, have you talked to your dad?" Yeah. And then go to dad. "Hey, dad, I talked to mom and she said," "Oh, she said, okay, go ahead."
Mm-hmm.
Comes back and mom's like, "What? You let him do? Well, he said he talked, what?" Like this triangulation piece in the
Mm-hmm.
healthiest home that happens.
Yeah.
Now you bring in the trauma, the drama, divorce, death, whatever it is that brought the blending together. And not only do you have triangulation, you have where like literally what can happen is you find yourself pitted against one another, and you might say something like, "Oh, they're doing it again." And I'm rather than being open and being like, "Well, what do you mean they're doing it again?" I get defensive.
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Don't you talk about my kid that way?"
Right.
And all of a sudden it's my kid rather than our family,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's so easy. It happens so easily.
So easily. I mean, we've both
Mm-hmm.
experienced it where we feel really defensive or protective
Mm-hmm.
over our kids
Mm-hmm.
when the other person's frustrated. If you're allowing this kind of dynamic or thought process of like, I'm loyal to my kids before I'm loyal to my new husband or my
Yeah.
new wife, there's going to easily become a major divide there.
Huge.
And why is it important for the marriage to be the foundation of everything in the family? Like, get a little biblical on us, Pastor.
Oh, sure, absolutely. So I was a pastor for 25
Yeah.
years. So when she calls me pastor, so one of the things like that's how God uniquely designed. When people talk about this, my partner or my part, it's actually husband or wife. It's not really partner. That's not a biblical definition of marriage. And there's this idea in Scripture where it talks about like the first principle of first mention. The first time something is mentioned in Scripture is how it's supposed to be set forth moving forward forever. So you have Adam, who in the garden, God said it's not good for man to be alone. So Adam falls asleep. God takes a rib, creates Eve. Adam wakes up. He's like, whoa. And he said, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone, you'll be called woman. And from that moment, God said, be fruitful and multiply. And it said that for this reason, the man will leave his family and cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And so the idea of the one flesh is like we're one flesh. Like even though our children, children come from that flesh, we are meant to be united. And it even says that Adam and Eve, they were together, they were naked and unashamed. And meaning the naked component, meaning they knew one another so intimately, it was like they were literally one flesh. And that's not just like sexual intimacy, it's actually emotional, mental, spiritual, physical.
Mm-hmm.
And so often today we focus so much on the physical intimacy that everything else gets blurred. But
Mm-hmm.
that's supposed to be actually the final thing. You're supposed to connect mentally, emotionally, spiritually,
Spiritually.
and then finally physically. That's the idea of one
Mm-hmm.
flesh. And so, really, the way God designed it, it's meant to be your relationship with God first, your relationship with each other next,
Mm-hmm.
and then your relationship with your children follows that. And then after that, extended family.
Yep.
And so that's kind of the idea when you think about it. And so when Allie talks about, this is like what we ascribe to. It's more than ascribe to. Like, this is one of those things that you can either be like, well, I don't believe that. That's fine. You don't have to believe that, but it's the truth and it's reality. And when you honor God in your marriage first, your kids see that. It becomes a healthier environment. And honestly, what kids need when they're pushing boundaries, they're testing to know that they can trust. And if they're pushing boundaries and all of a sudden we fracture and we're like, well, I'm not sure. And there's moments of uncertainty, but as long as they know, hey, it's us first and you second, and it's even okay to say that. And you might even hurt their little feelings. And that's okay because you're drawing a line, you're drawing a boundary, because one day those little kids are not going to be little anymore and they're not going to live in your home anymore. And then they're going to go out and get married and they need to understand what a healthy marriage looks like. And it starts healthy between the husband and the wife first and foremost. And then from that, children come afterwards.
So
Was that
thank you.
good?
Yes, that
Yeah.
was great. So, I mean, summary is it is the natural order that God has set in place for the marriage to come first. And
100%.
this covenant between you to be like you're uniting as one
100%.
flesh. And so, even if you're divorced, even if this is a second marriage, that covenant should be just as sacred. It should be just the same, right? Like
Correct.
it's not a lesser covenant.
No.
And so that's one of the things where it's like we see it often approached a little bit more casually or, just
Well,
not
almost like not totally all in.
yeah.
Like, hey, you know what? The first one ended, and I'm waiting for the shoe to drop on this second marriage, and so I'm just gonna hold back. I'm not gonna be fully vulnerable or fully transparent or fully all in
Yep.
because I know this one might end as well. And there's a lot of reasons for that, like the
Oh,
trauma, the drama, the
absolutely.
difficulty, like the mistrust.
It's not a surprise that
Mm-mm,
somebody would approach it that way. It
mm-mm.
it makes sense. Those are just signs of needing to continuing
The healing
the healing
process,
process.
100%.
And you can do that together.
I think that's important. I
Yeah.
think I think there has to be a level of health that you achieve on your own before you re-enter the dating game, you re-enter the marriage, like the one flesh that we just talked about. There's a level of health you have to achieve on your own
Mm-hmm.
before that. But I think it doesn't mean, okay, we're married now,
It
so
doesn't
everything's
mean you're
great.
done. Yeah.
We're 100% healed. We're 100% healthy. Like, no, there's still moments that we have
No.
to give space to one another.
Well, that's the thing. I see that all the time with people who I have multiple friends who have been through a divorce and they're working hard to heal as a single
Mhm,
person
mhm,
and they've done a lot of hard work and they've done what they need to do, but once you're back in a relationship
mhm.
or married again, like there are going to be things that you cannot address just as a single person.
Yeah.
It will only come up now that you're back in a relationship or back in a
Mhm.
marriage. So that process of healing is not just done no matter how whole or
Mhm.
healthy you feel as a single
Mhm.
person, there's going to be more to work through than once you're back in a relationship.
I mean, a great example of that is say that your previous spouse cheated on you and you're having to deal with that. You're getting healthy from that. Well, you won't fully ever heal from that until you fully trust again.
Yep.
And obviously, every like text message that comes in that you don't know who it is or a phone call, you're like, hey, who was that? What was that? What's happening? What's going on? And trust is something that takes time,
Mhm.
right? And trust is something that's tested. And so that's
And it
something.
can't be tested until you're in a situation where you're vulnerable. So you have to trust someone.
100%. I was
Yes.
thinking about the idea. I took a rock climbing class in college, and you're going up it's lead climb, so you're going, or it was top rope, so you're going up, you're harnessed in, you get to the top, you hit a bell, and then you come down. You don't really need the harness, A, until you fall, or until B, you've achieved your goal, and you have to sit back in it. And the only reason you feel like it's trustworthy is that when you're, feet are on the ground, you sit back in it to trust it. Well, if it's not tested on the ground, I'm not going to trust it at the top. And
Mhm.
so it's one of those things that you can only truly trust something once you've tested that thing. And once again, the relationship, you're going through it, you're like, I'm trying to rebuild trust.
Mhm.
Well, it has to be tested, if
Yep.
that makes sense. And you can't test trust on your own.
Yep. Some other, we've camped out on this a lot, but it is so foundational
So
and it
incredibly
is
valuable.
something that we often see people not really doing, putting the marriage first. So we've talked about the kind of spiritual reasoning for that, but some practical things too, just as a part of putting the marriage first and why that's important. You already touched on it a little bit, but your kids, no matter what their age, they can be grown adults. You are teaching them about relationships and marriage through how you're living it out.
100%.
And so if you're modeling something less than what's, really healthy, that's impacting how they're going to show up and how they're going to approach relationships and marriage.
I have an example I have to
Yeah,
share. So I
please.
was just talking with Noah. Noah's 18. He's our second oldest, my second oldest. And we are just at a men's retreat. We're driving back, and it was like 2 in the morning because we had to get on a really early flight. And he just said this thing. It was really, he'd never said anything like this to me before. And he just said there was a while that he was frustrated with me because he thought that I loved Allie more than I loved Tiffany, his biological mother. And he was dealing with that. And he was like in this space where he was really conflicted. And maybe your kids are conflicted too, where they're like, well, I think that dad loves, his new wife more than my mom.
Yeah.
And so there's this conflict happening. But it was interesting because as we talked about it, I just listened and he just said, I was mad at you at first, but then I realized, well, mom's not here, so that's not really a thing. But then B, he said, what if dad didn't love Allie as much as he does? What would that mean for us? And I just thought about that. I was like, that's a really great pickup by an 18-year-old who's like, what would that mean for you? No, it would mean instability. It would mean insecurity. It would feel like, okay, dad, how close should I get to Allie? Because are you guys just going to end this thing and then my heart's going to be tore up too? I mean, that's one thing your kids are dealing with as well. They're dealing with the idea of like the trauma and the drama from the ending of your previous marriage. And now
Yeah.
you're into another marriage and you're like, well, mom or dad, like you have a new like spouse, but I'm still connected to the old one and I don't know how I should feel about the new one. And that's got to be so incredibly difficult for them
Yep.
to process.
Yep.
And if this isn't stable and healthy, they're not going to fully buy in. They're not going to fully be vulnerable. They'll be like, well, I'm just going to sit back and probably cop an attitude a lot.
Which they
And just
probably are already.
because they're teenagers.
Yeah.
I mean, just for
Because
real.
they're kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even if they're adults. Even if they're, not really participating in the blending process or they aren't a fan of you being remarried or in a new relationship or whatever it is, the stability of your relationship still impacts them and speaks to them.
In a huge way.
Even if they're kind of like hands off, like.
And it's an example to them, regardless if they're in there, like we talk about Amos was 3, right? When I stepped in. And Jack was 14. And so there's a very great varying degree of difference there, but also like if they're in their early 20s, like, okay, how stable is dad's new marriage? How stable is mom's new marriage? What are they doing here? They're taking notes, they're observing, right? Like, and they're learning what is healthy and what is unhealthy, what they'd like to emulate in their marriage and what they would never want to emulate in their marriage. And it really is, it's based upon your marriage, mom and dad's marriage.
So some of the ways that we really worked on putting our marriage first and still putting a lot of time and effort into the kids and building our family culture and all of that. But we have date night weekly, especially thinking about, what it's like to get married and have an instant family. Like my first marriage, I was 23 when we got married and we were single. We didn't have kids for like 5 years. That's such a different experience.
So different. So
than
much
getting
time.
married and you have 7 kids in the house.
Yeah, like we went on our mini moon, we call it, because it wasn't a full honeymoon because it was in COVID. And we came back to, well, first of all, we came back to Thanksgiving dinner at different homes. Like your parents, my parents, we didn't even have our own specific Thanksgiving dinner. And then there's 7 kids and the blending process is immediately started.
So it's already a situation that's so trying for like a newly married couple.
Yeah.
And so if you are not prioritizing your marriage, time together, carving out that time, like how are you even supposed to really build a brand new healthy marriage and relationship? And so just practically speaking, like it's so important to carve out that time, make sure that you are building up your own relationship, giving that space to each other, being able to still like date each other a little bit and have a romance because that's just so very difficult.
Well, because part of it is us becoming.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're becoming one in this,
Mm-hmm.
right? When we talk about like the one flesh and like we're becoming that, right?
Yeah.
And like
Yeah.
there's only so much like, okay, you lived an hour and a half away, hour and 15 minutes. And like all of a sudden, like now we're in the same home, same space, same everything. Like it's just different and we're becoming one. And then we have 7 children's mental, emotional, physical, spiritual needs immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Like you went from cooking dinner for the boys, for Elijah and Ames, putting them to bed, then you cooking dinner for yourself, to all of a sudden jumping in and we're trying to figure out, okay, what does dinner look like for 7
Yeah.
children,
Yeah.
right? And so it
Mm-hmm.
was like, so it takes time, but we're becoming, and if we didn't give time and space for that,
Yeah.
that wouldn't have gone well.
No. And so carving out date nights, I think another thing that really happened is we just weren't as concerned about other friendships and relationships. Like we knew that some of that had to go a little bit on the back burner because you only have so much capacity
Yeah.
in life. And if you're trying to just give everything to everyone else, like something is going to suffer. And so it's not that you forsake, friendships or relationships at all. Like community is so important.
So important.
And we needed support around us, but we just had to like right size some of that because when you're a single parent, you're spending a lot of time with your support network,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Like tons of family time, friends filling in space.
Because you have that
you
time.
you have that time,
Yeah.
you need that support. And so again, you're not forsaking that or just like abandoning people who have been there for you. That's not the message. But we did have to right size how we were spending time with extended family, with friends. Like we couldn't keep the same level of connectivity or like priority on that time because now we had to fit in a whole new marriage
Yeah.
and focus so much on supporting our kids through the process.
And I think even looking at that, like it was definitely a season.
Mm-hmm.
There was a season we had to go deep. We had to focus. We had to lock in and be like, okay, this is about like the initial phase of blending. Because, like, if we had not been intentional about that, if we'd been kind of like willy nilly about it, just like, well, whatever happens, happens, or the kids will just be great, they'll just blend, like unintentionally, it would have been really bad. Like, it was hard enough as it was.
Yeah.
Like there was a lot of challenges as it was.
Yeah.
Something practically like A, date each other. That's really big.
Mm-hmm.
B, be sure that you're. I think that's the secondary piece is the season of putting your family first. The blending of the when I say family, like those who live in your home.
The family nucleus.
The family nucleus,
Yeah.
nucleus. Like like we talked in the previous episode about not using the word step. Like you're not stepmom, I'm not stepdad, it's not stepbrother, stepsister, like we're family, right? And just being super intentional to use that verbiage. And that was really established in the first few weeks and months
Yeah.
because we're all kind of like new roommates and stuff. Not just us figuring out like, okay, Jeff, you leave your socks on the floor, or I'm frustrated because I leave the toilet seat up, or just the little nuances that like when you're first married and it's just the two of you, no kids, like you find out.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now we're finding this out in like 9 different degrees,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like you're finding out like you weren't used to teenagers. You went from your oldest child being
Mm.
4,
Mm-hmm.
5, 6,
Mm-hmm.
something like that.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden a 14, 15-year-old, you're like, oh dear God. Like they're so loud and they're so big and they're so stinky and they're so like all the things. And so that was just a huge thing. And if we
Yeah.
hadn't given a space in that season, our blending would have been really, really challenging, especially now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a great point. I think about like all the tension points that you have like in a new relationship. Like you said, like, a level of cleanliness. Like
Right.
there's somebody
Like
always
preference.
messier,
Yes.
than the other. Just even like routines, how you want to live life when you get up, what you want to do at night. Like there's all these things where it's like, oh, like we don't match up. We have to figure that out. We have to navigate through it. There's a lot of tension points. Add on just not those for a couple, but tension points around how you parent, tension
Yes.
points around each and every single kid and your relationship with them and everything that's going. Like there's so much. It's like a
Well,
minefield.
100%. And then even tension point on I parent and how you allow me to parent Elijah and Amos,
Yeah.
and then how you parent and how I allow you to parent Jack, Noah, Sally, Finn, and Bo.
Yes.
Like that's a huge tension point that working through.
Huge.
So the family component, that secondary piece, making sure you give space to it, you give time to it. It's a season, and a season usually you think about, okay, so summer is 3 months long. Okay, it's probably going to be longer than that, but
The
just
first 3 to 6 months, think of your new marriage and your new family in that blending process as a new full-time job, right? Like you
seriously,
need to create
yeah,
space and time for it.
yeah,
You need to be able to be present. So slowing some other things
yeah,
down so that you can give it the time and attention so that you have mental and emotional capacity, create that space.
yeah. Be intentional about it. Like put, like Ali said, other things on the back burner. Create specific time and space to do that. Like
Yeah.
go on a vacation. Create memories together. It doesn't have to be a big deal. It doesn't have to be like we're going on a massive cruise. It can be like, let's go rent a VRBO for a weekend, a 4-day weekend somewhere. Let's just go make memories together and figure this out together. Let's laugh together. Let's cry together. Let's just be together. And I think that is a huge, huge step to the blending process.
Well, so we went deep on this one.
Yeah, we did.
We have lots more thoughts and lessons. So we'll have
Come on back, future
another
podcasts.
episode.
This is the Wake Coaching Podcast. We're so glad you're here today. If this benefited you at all, I encourage you, comment, like, share. Be sure to subscribe to our page, and we'll have more brilliant blending ideas coming your way. Sound good?
Bye.